I'm back with Zach Laws and Luca Giliberti. Here we are to talk about Best Drama Writing and Directing. Leading the odds is Game of Thrones in directing for the episode The Long Night. In drama writing, leading the odds is Nice and Neat from Killing Eve. And I have to take the Gold Derby odds to task because in both categories, Succession is ranked last. Now, this is partly due to kind of a glitch in the prediction center where Succession was initially not listed in directing. So the first, couple hundred people, they don't even have it listed seventh in their predictions. It's just not ranked at all. But Zach, we are both now on the editor's page. So I think between us, maybe we make up like 4% of the odds or something. That was still not enough. It is still ranked last in drama directing and drama writing. Drama directing is especially egregious because Adam McKay just won the Directors Guild of America Award, which shares voters, and it's for the same episode, same category, all that kind of stuff. So I guess, Luca, you are not predicting it in either category, so maybe you're not really that sympathetic to this rant.
So, I don't know. I just think, with 32 nominations, I think Game of Thrones is going to sweep. I mean, I don't think it's going to necessarily sweep all the acting categories, but I think it can take directing and it can take writing, and I'm certain that it'll take a drama series. Strangely enough, as since the series finale, the Iron Throne was very polarizing, I actually think the show is actually safer in writing than it is in directing, because David Benioff and D.B. Weiss have no internal competition. It's just their script against other shows. Whereas in directing, there are 3 Game of Thrones episodes. We have Miguel Sapochnik for The Long Night. We have David Nutter for The Last of the Starks. And then we have David and Dan for The Iron Throne. So they could risk splitting the vote, which could have been the case last year when 2 Game of Thrones episodes were nominated and neither of them won. And instead, Stephen Daldry won for The Crown. And then I had to think about it, whether one of these episodes would actually stand out. And I ultimately still put The Long Night in number 1 because everyone knows that this episode took 55 night shoots. Everyone knows that this episode was one of the biggest battle spectacles we've ever seen on TV or a movie or in any movie. And I just feel like it's an episode that everyone remembers. That being said, if voters, feel like rewarding the show in general, I wouldn't be surprised if they gave their votes to David and Dan in both categories, which is why I really am not all too sure about The Long Night. And that's why I believe I have Succession in second place, because as you said, Adam McKay just won DGA. He might still have all the goodwill from Vice, and he could easily win. And the Succession pilot, or his episode, is very acclaimed.
Now, Zach, you are predicting Adam McKay in directing, but you just switched to The Long Night, The Iron Throne in writing. So what spurred that change?
Oh, okay, so here's the thing. In directing, right, you've got these 3 Game of Thrones episodes. And Luca made a very good point about how The Long Night is their battle episode, and usually those do very well in the directing category. Only problem is it's also up against the finale, right? And I think that because the finale is also in writing, that's going to pull some votes in directing as well. Because usually Game of Thrones, they don't split which episodes are going to win in writing and directing. They usually just win both for one episode, right? So there's the problem of vote splitting. Now, where does that vote go to? I think it goes to Adam McKay, who, of course, is an Academy Award winner, celebrity director, just won the DGA, was just nominated for an Academy Award for Vice, is had a very critically acclaimed episode of television that he can compete for, right? Now, in terms of writing, there is only one Game of Thrones nominee in writing. And I know that there was, shall we say, a mixed reaction to the writing of that finale. Not necessarily maybe from the TV Academy, but, from viewers and critics and all that stuff. But the reason why I think that it can still win writing is, what's its second place competition?
Exactly.
Last year, I think it was pretty well known that The Americans was going to finally get some love, and it was kind of an easy call to predict it in writing over Game of Thrones, which, had won the previous 2 years that it was eligible. This year, I mean, just looking at the other nominees that we have here, I don't know. I mean, I guess possibly Succession, possibly Killing Eve. I don't think Bodyguard is necessary as a factor here. Better Call Saul has never won a writing award. The Handmaid's Tale could just come out of nowhere and win for, that weird hanging episode. I mean, honestly, I think I'm going to put that in second place just because it is the second most nominated drama series for a grand total of 3 episodes that aired over a year ago. But yeah, I think that's what's going to work in Game of Thrones' favor, is that it's not competing against itself, and it doesn't have an obvious competitor in writing. Directing is going to be a little more hard, and that's why I'm betting on Adam McKay. I should, just, if it's not going to be Adam McKay, I should say The Handmaid's Tale's won here before. There's also Jason Bateman for Ozark. That's a show that kind of blew up this year. And there's also a Killing Eve episode. But I think that McKay is probably your best bet for a spoiler.
Yeah, I think you brought up a very important point in the writing category, because I do think the 2 shows that could upset or could beat Game of Thrones are The Handmaid's Tale and Killing Eve. Those are the shows that I have in second and third place. So Killing Eve is no longer written by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, but that doesn't mean that voters necessarily know that. So there's a good chance that voters are still voting for Phoebe Waller-Bridge's achievement in the first season, which is why I think it could win despite its submission, which is the second episode of the season, which, is very strange. It was a very strange submission, in my opinion. But I do think, since the show did get a writing nomination last year, I think there's some goodwill. And The Handmaid's Tale, we already know the writing branch, the writers branch likes The Handmaid's Tale. They gave it the win in the first season, and they nominated it last year. In addition to that, the third season is airing right now. They just had one of their biggest, arguably best episodes of the series. And we don't, sometimes voters vote for seasons that are also airing at the moment. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that win as well. As for Better Call Saul, I would like to predict it. And Winner is a very acclaimed episode, but this show has barely won anything. And I won't put it in number 1 until I actually see it win something.
Yeah, it turns out there's a lot to talk about here, but I'll just go off your last point about Better Call Saul. The thing about that show for me is, I don't know, maybe one of you know this, it's been nominated, 30-something times at this point. It hasn't won anything outside of, a win for one of its kind of side programs in the franchise, some online tie-in. But it just seems like it has a consistent level of support within the Academy, and sometimes that's enough for a nomination, and sometimes it's not. It seems to fall in and out of categories somewhat randomly. It doesn't follow the normal trajectory of pretty much every other show, which is, they get more nominations until they stop getting more nominations, then they lose nominations. Normally there's a very clear, peak, mountain, triangle, or whatever. Better Call Saul, it just seems like whatever happens to whatever else is in contention, that influences how many nominations it gets. Now, this year we do have a lot of shows out of contention, so maybe it can slide into the winner's circle in writing. But yeah, I'm not sure how much passion there is. And I also have a similar concern about Succession, which I'm actually predicting to win both of these categories. Wow. But yeah, I'm very concerned that there's actually just no passion at all for this show. I wondered months ago whether it would become the Silicon Valley of drama. And by the time nominations rolled around, I was predicting it for far more than that. But it ended up being exactly that, where it got into series, it got writing for its finale, it got directing for its pilot, it got a main title nomination, and it got a random creative arts nomination. The exact same 5 nominations that Silicon Valley got. And Silicon Valley in general has struggled to win at the Emmys because it seems like they like it. It's got significant visibility being on HBO, but it's not something that really gets them excited. And before throwing it over to Zach, I'll just talk about why I don't have Game of Thrones winning either category. I actually don't think that vote splitting is going to be that big a deal in directing. I mean, it's overcome vote splitting in the category a couple times before, not last year, but I ran a poll in the forum where I asked, if you were an Emmy voter, like what would you vote for out of the 3 episodes? And it surprised me that the results were almost unanimous. I think that, the Long Night was the one that they hyped up for months, as taking 55 nights to film. And at this point, I feel like people remember that maybe a bit more than not being able to see the episode when it aired. So I feel like it has the goodwill that it needs to be the choice from Game of Thrones. But I'm trying to avoid predicting Game of Thrones for wins because of all of the inspired winners that we saw at the Emmys last year. At the Emmys last year, I thought we saw wins that that I thought would never happen under the system, where you would have somebody like Elizabeth Moss win for season 1 over Claire Foy for her season 1, and then it flips the next year because the Emmy voters are paying attention. It seemed like the Emmys were just really savvy last year about what was going on with television, and I think we kind of saw that in the comedy nominations. So I think that if they're all watching, television, and they're voting for the winners, I think they'll avoid Game of Thrones as much as they can in these individual categories. It does have 32 nominations, which is more than ever, but we do often see visibility kind of rule the day with nominations, be it, the second season of The Handmaid's Tale or the second season of Homeland, or even the second season of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which I think we're all kind of jumping away from as our predicted winner in comedy series. But it just blows up in nominations because the nominating ballots do not measure passion at all.
I would like to just make a plea to any Emmy voters who are going to be watching The Long Night. Make sure that you properly calibrate your televisions after you take them out of the box, because I think that it would help you out a little bit to see it in all its glory. You're right, Riley. I mean, I think that last year, the last couple of years in general, have proved that they are paying more attention to what's going on in television. One thing that could help Succession is the fact that it's going to be airing its second season during Emmy voting. And depending on how it lives up to the first season, that could be a thing that helps it in some of the categories that it's nominated in. One of the things that does make me hesitant to predict it for much of anything is the fact that it underperformed in nominations. But I don't know if that's necessarily its fault so much as it is sometimes people are just late to new programs. And certainly in a year where obviously they had one clear favorite television show, they might have just overlooked much of anything else. But I think that, I get your point about The Long Night and about how there might not be much vote splitting there, as I'm thinking. I don't think the third episode has much of a chance at all, with all due respect. But I think that the fact that so often they don't tend to, when they're going to give a show both writing and directing, at least in the last few years, it tends to be for the same exact episode. Mm-hmm. And so I just think that there's going to be people who are going to vote for the Iron Throne because it's also nominated in writing. Do you know what I mean? And I think that could end up hurting Sapochnik's chances overall.
And just to talk about some of the other directing nominees in this category, I think Killing Eve's directing nomination is actually quite significant because it's for, the fourth episode of the season, which, could be random to some people, for others not so much. It's one of my favorite episodes of the season. But what's surprising about it is that the director, her name is Lisa Brühlmann, is actually a Swiss director. And, she has a few credits in the US, so for American TV shows, but Killing Eve is still one of her first ones. And I think it's quite the achievement to have gotten into this category with, all of these Game of Thrones people and with people like Adam McKay. I don't think she will win because I'm not sure Killing Eve is the directorial achievement, but I do think her nomination is significant. And Dana Reed for The Handmaid's Tale is just coming off her DGA nomination for that exact episode. And again, I don't think she will actually win, but she is probably somewhere in the top 4 or 5. And her episode Holly is also a great directorial achievement. And then we have, of course, Reparations, which is the second season premiere of Ozark, directed by Jason Bateman, who also just submitted that episode as his acting submission. And there seems to be a lot of respect for him in the industry, especially from the TV Academy. And he was nominated last year alongside another Ozark episode. So there is a lot of support for Ozark in the director's branch.
I'll say about Killing Eve, I wonder if that is actually the alternative, if Game of Thrones is not going to be winning these two categories. I kind of look at last year where, Game of Thrones didn't win directing, so they went with Stephen Daldry. And then a few years ago when The People versus O.J. Simpson split and they went with The Night Manager. And you could look at that as kind of being like, there is a block of support within the director's branch that is partial to these bigger film directors, and that would favor Adam McKay. Or maybe it's just, that kind of European block again where they favor, the European directors, which would be Killing Eve. So I'm kind of defaulting to Adam McKay as the movie director, since we do see them win in the directing category, even under the tape system when you think that the playing field would kind of be leveled by that kind of voting system. But I could easily see Killing Eve taking it instead. In writing, Killing Eve is actually the front runner. I don't have it because I feel like the writer's branch, again, is generally pretty savvy about the way television is going, even more so than the other branches, where last year they'll award the Americans, and the Americans isn't nominated in directing, etc. The second season of Killing Eve was acclaimed, but not quite as well received as the first season, and I feel like the writer's branch kind of snubbing the second season of Ozark, which was much more widely viewed within the industry, and it seems like it was more widely liked by them as well, is kind of a sign that the writer's branch still has their sensibilities intact, since that was not a critically acclaimed season.
I wouldn't be surprised if, Emmy voters aren't necessarily emotional, but Game of Thrones is one of the biggest shows on TV, a show that hit the zeitgeist in a very profound way. I wouldn't be surprised if they said, this is the last time that we can reward this show, and we'll just check it off. It wouldn't surprise me at all. And I'm wondering if the support for Game of Thrones is so strong that vote splitting wouldn't even hurt its chances in categories like directing or even, supporting actress or supporting actor. And I'm very curious to see if they can finally win more categories than they could in the past, because then I think that the final season narrative is actually very important and does mean something to the Emmy voters. And I know I keep jumping back and forth, but one, argument against the Game of Thrones series finale in writing is what Riley mentioned before, is that the writers do their homework. We've seen very inspired wins, as I mentioned before, for The Handmaid's Tale, for the pilot that was incredibly well received. And then last year you had the series finale of The Americans, which, was considered one of the all-time greats, in terms of series finales. And then you have The Iron Throne, which is an episode that a lot of people didn't like. I personally didn't like it at all. I think there's a reason why that petition was started on the internet. Then again, I don't know what it's very difficult to differentiate between the internet buzz and the love for the show in the TV Academy. So it's very difficult to see whether, there's much more support for the show there than in the general public.
I mean, it would be the worst reviewed episode ever to win this category, probably.
Exactly.
One more writing nominee that I don't think we've mentioned is Bodyguard, which I think we're just kind of discounting because it's not nominated in any other individual achievement category. It's only nominated for writing and series. This is not a knock on the quality of Bodyguard. I would vote for it personally in this category, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like an also ran, especially considering the fact that they couldn't even get Richard Madden in. And I know a lot of people had him predicted to win Best Actor. So I don't know. I mean, possibly it's possible, but I don't know. It feels like such an afterthought at this time that I don't see it doing much of anything.